Hey everyone, it's your girl Mya Kay with The Deep. I'm so excited about episode 2, and today's topic is very dear to my heart, and I believe it is actually near and dear to the hearts of a lot of believers, especially those of us who do already work in entertainment. And so today's question, because of course it's okay for us to question God in a very healthy way because he can handle it. And he would rather us ask him and get an answer from him than to not ask and have other voices leading us astray. And so today's topic is working in entertainment as a Christian. Is it okay? I think the challenge with this topic and why it's so important for us to discuss it and why so many people have challenges with it is because there are so many Christians who are sitting on their gifts. So many Christians feel like if I'm a dentist, then I should be a Christian dentist with a Christian practice and hire Christian employees and make sure that all of our stock and inventory is ordered from Christian businesses. And then they wonder why, when they're working, though it may be fulfilling, it doesn't always feel very purposeful. Well, that's because we were created to go into the world and expel the darkness and not run from it. And that's actually one of my first points. Darkness doesn't mean we run, we go forward to expel. And so I believe God, when we accept Christ as our Savior and we are kingdom generals, as I like to say, then it is our job to then, in a way, run towards the darkness. When you have a Marine or someone who's in the Army and they sign up for boot camp, they run toward the danger. When they're called for war, they run toward the danger because that's just what they were trained to do. And it's the same for us. We were trained to expel the darkness because we are the light. But you can't expel what you're afraid of, and you can't expel that which you won't confront. And so we were called to go in to what we consider dark spaces. I think the other thing that we have to remember and consider is that God created Hollywood. So God's power does not stop at the gates of Hollywood. God's power goes through Hollywood, to Hollywood, in and around Hollywood. And so the challenge is many of us were raised in churches. We were raised in the Baptist church or non-denominational or Pentecostal or apostolic. And because we were raised in churches where, we saw musicians using their gifts in the church and we saw singers using their gifts in the church. And then the fear becomes if you step into a different territory that's not the four walls of the church, God's covering is removed from you. Well, that's actually not true because God instructs us in his word plenty of times to go into the world and preach the gospel. And I just want a lot of my young believers to understand that it is your job to not please your parents, nor your pastor, nor the laws of the religion in which we were raised. It's your job to obey God. There were plenty of people, I'm sure, that questioned Abraham going, and plenty of people who questioned, when Ruth decided to stay with her mother-in-law. And so when you have someone speaking to you and it isn't laced with the voice of God, then you have to wonder where that voice is coming from. And people's intentions may be good, but only God has the best intentions because his intentions are God intentions. And so I just think it's important for you to remember as you move forward with your destiny and purpose, if God has called you to entertainment, to make sure that you are hearing his voice and sometimes even not your own. So when I say God's power does not stop at the gates of Hollywood, I actually believe God's power increases in areas that many people would be afraid to go as a believer. God's power increases in an area like Hollywood. Why? Because it is considered a dark world. I remember people saying that's the devil's playground when I was growing up, or that's a sin den that you want to stay away from. And At the end of the day, God created all things for his power and glory. I'm sorry, for his glory and to be used for him. And the enemy perverted it. So, I mean, if you really think about it, God created the devil. He was an angel and he just decided he wanted to be stronger and bigger than God. And God said no. So we have to remember that God created all things that pertains to life and godliness. That means our entertainment and everything else. What people choose to do with their gifts, whether they use it for the kingdom of light or the kingdom of darkness, is up to them. Speaking of that, when I think of Hollywood and other territories, we have to remember that the believers, God owns that territory. The enemy is only borrowing it. And we didn't loan it to him. Then again, maybe some of us did. See, I think what happened was hundreds and hundreds of years ago, when Hollywood was really booming. Think about the time of Walt Disney or some of our other great icons that may no longer be with us, but they've passed down a legacy of entertainment and arts to their children. And I think what happened was, because so many believers started to run from these industries and were afraid to pursue what God told them to do, then all of a sudden the enemy decided, well, since they're not taking use of this territory, I'm just going to borrow it. He thinks he's stealing it, but he actually is only borrowing it. And so in a way, we did loan it to him because we've decided that God can't do anything in a territory where the enemy is. Well, that's actually not true. The opposite is true. We can do more in a territory that the enemy thinks that he's taken over. As someone who just moved back to her home city, her hometown of Philadelphia, and who spent a year in LA, the last year literally, I know exactly why some believers may be afraid. I met so many people who were into psychic readings and tarot cards and astrology and Scientology and cults. And unfortunately, that's just what they believe. But here's the thing. That stuff exists everywhere, not just Hollywood. It's just magnified in Hollywood and glorified in Hollywood. Why? Because there are too many believers running from this industry that God has called us to. My podcast, Keys to the Game, is actually a kingdom-driven podcast. Every person who I interview, I pray over. And it just so happens that every person who I've had on the show, with the exception of one, has been a believer. I didn't create it that way. That's just who God led to the podcast, and those were the celebrity guests that said yes. What I love about it is that I am interviewing actors, music producers, publishing gurus, and you name it. I've interviewed them. And what this allows me to do, artists, fashion moguls, what this allows me to do is continue to plant the seeds that God has told me to plant in this here business called entertainment, so that there are people who get to see that believers have a job to do in entertainment. Sometimes we're called to even go to remind the believers who've been there longer than us that they're supposed to take God with them and not leave him at the gates of Hollywood. That's the challenge. The challenge isn't, do believers go? It's believers should go. And in fact, we should go in multitudes, and we should do what God called us to do. But many believers leave God at the gate of Hollywood because they're afraid people won't accept them. One of my favorite people whom I've had the pleasure of meeting and working with is Devon Franklin. And Devon Franklin is a mega producer. He's a minister and he's an author. And of course, many people know him as Megan Good's husband. And what I love about him is that he stood on his principles when he was offered a position in Hollywood, that he would not work on the Sabbath. That was something he took with him. And you know what they said? They honor that. Now, for those who don't know, the Sabbath is not Sunday. It's actually Saturday. And so he was really risking a job, and probably plenty of jobs, because the average person in Hollywood, Sunday may be okay, but Saturdays are a given. And so I think it's important for us to remember that God has called us to these places not to be like them, but to actually take back the territory which the enemy thinks he owns. The other thing is, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And what I mean by that is those areas that so many believers have been convinced that they shouldn't go to are actually harvest areas. So when you're wondering why you haven't received your breakthrough or your harvest, You have to ask yourself, have you stepped into the arena that God has called you to? Elijah knew when it was time to move on. He had been called to go, and so he went. When the brook dried up, then he was called to the widow woman, and she had provision for him there. When you don't move your feet, you can pray all day, but putting hands and feet to your prayers is what allows God to send in the reinforcements that you need to carry you through to your destiny. I think it's pretty simple. And lastly, Mark 16:15 says, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. This means that every part of the four corners of the earth belongs to God. If we want to get technical, we can say Mars and Venus and everything else, because that's a creation that God made. It's not a Big Bang theory, it's God. And so when you say things like, I thank the universe, it doesn't make sense because God created the universe. It's almost like a direct slap in the face to the creator of something that you're thinking. And so I'm saying all of this to say that as a woman who works in entertainment, as a woman who has worked with celebrities and who has worked the NAACP Image Awards, who's worked the Merge Summit and plenty of other events in and out of Hollywood, who has covered Philly Fashion Week for 5 seasons, who has been around anybody that's everybody. I just want you guys to know that it is possible. But you have to be willing to go when he says and come back when he says. I wasn't afraid to leave Hollywood just because I hadn't had a film made yet. I pitched MGM Studios, and I pitched them more than one project, and I left my seeds there because it's none of my business what happens after that. We're told to go and sow. Let God do the reaping for us. And so I can speak to this topic very well because I've lived it. Even when I was in Atlanta, 5 years ago, I've lived it. And because I've lived it and I've been in it, I can tell you there's so many Christians. God is sending so many Christians into Hollywood in influxes of number. Like, it's crazy how many people he has sent. The question is, are you prepared to go? Are you ready to go? And are you ready to move when he says move? Because you can't be so addicted to the fame and the industry that if he says move, you don't hear it. And see, I was able to move confidently whether I had gotten what I wanted or not, or what he showed me or not, because I know staying somewhere where God is not, that's when your protection is removed. So it isn't that God isn't in Hollywood. It's just that you have to make sure that he sent you and that you're there with him at the same time. So, working in entertainment as a Christian, is it okay? It is. I pray that you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to follow us at The Deep Talk TV, The Deep Talk TV on Instagram. Make sure you email me at maya@thedeeptalk.tv if you have any suggestions for a topic or questions. And also follow me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Writer Mya. And my website is Writer Mya as well. I'm so excited to be with you guys, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Peace.